There we go. Okay, everyone. So let me just start with a little bit of welcome and introductions, and then we'll get started with our program here. We are going to be talking about the State Apprenticeship Expansion Grant that is currently pending with the Department of Labor. I want to start with a really important sort of qualifier to this work, which is to say, we are not the Department of Labor and do not speak for the Department of Labor. Any official notice around the grant or information around the grant has to come from the Department of Labor. And so I just want to be able to say we have plenty of opinions and ideas about the State Apprenticeship Expansion Grant, but we're not the official, the source of the official word on that. And then I also just want to say a couple of housekeeping tidbits here. Please do use the chat for questions, comments as we go. It's helpful for us both to keep track of the comments that we get during this session, and also just a good way to communicate with the community here. Use your raise hand function to let us know if you've got a question or a comment that you want to make. We'll be taking breaks during the presentations and certainly have plenty of time at the end for conversation. And speaking of the end, I do want to say that we are also going to be staying on after the session is concluded. So if you have specific questions or a chat you want to, or conversation you want to have afterwards, both Amy Beller and I will be hanging out a little bit after for questions and comments. And so with that as our preliminary, I'm just going to share a little bit of a PowerPoint here to get us started. Oh, and by the way, you may find it helpful for this session to use the speaker view for your view. So if you turn that on, that'll probably be helpful for you. All right. With that, I'm going to I'm going to turn to just a couple of introductory remarks here. Let me just do that. There we go. So first off, just a little bit of context about this conversation today. We are at this moment looking at the third in a series of grants that have been made under the auspices of the State Apprenticeship Expansion Grant idea. And in some ways, it's a very sort of ho-hum kind of thing. It's the sort of thing that the Department of Labor does to support work in apprenticeship in the states. But in another respect, it gives us a window, and maybe sort of our first window, into what the Trump administration might be thinking about apprenticeship. And I have really sort of four comments I want to make by way of framing on that. The first is that we're still talking about a state apprenticeship expansion grant. This process was actually started under the Biden administration, it wouldn't have been surprising to those of us who have been watching what's going on in Washington to see that the state apprenticeship expansion grant was just put on hold or stopped or whatever. And it hasn't been. And so don't want to read too much into that, but it does suggest that there's interest and support for apprenticeship at the Department of Labor. So we'll take that as a positive sign for now. And then three other things that I wanted to say that really relate to some of the amendments to the solicitation that were just published last week by the Department of Labor. The first is, if you look over some of those changes, a real focus on states, that the apprenticeship work that's described and the kinds of activities that are to be supported with this grant really seem to focus heavily on states and empowering states to drive apprenticeship expansion. So you'll see a number of cases where detailed guidance from the Department of Labor has been stripped out to provide more flexibility to the states, and where states have been encouraged to take more ownership, I guess you could say, of the apprenticeship system, especially in thinking about their conversion to state apprenticeship, SAA state status. The second thing that I wanted to say is that there is a push in some of the amendments, or you could conclude from some of the language in some of the amendments, that there's a push for simplification and streamlining. And this shouldn't be too much of a surprise because in Trump 1, there was quite a bit of conversation about IRAPs as really an answer to a registered apprenticeship system that was viewed as cumbersome or difficult, and there should be some simpler way to do apprenticeships. So I think there's some continuity of thinking around that. And the third thing that, again, won't be a surprise to anyone who's been watching what's been going on in Washington in the last couple of months is a focus on ensuring that the programming work that comes out of the State Apprenticeship Expansion Grant is, in the vernacular of this administration, benefiting all Americans, which is to say specialized targeting of particular populations has been de-emphasized in this grant. I will say not eliminated because there's still a provision for some targeted efforts supporting Americans with disabilities. But nevertheless, I think you can see a pretty consistent theme around that. And at the risk of losing 9/10 of the people who have signed into this webinar, let me just say, and for clarity's sake, only states and territories are allowed to apply for this grant. But as my co-presenter, Amy Beller, is about to tell you, there are opportunities for non-state entities to participate in the process. And so we want to be very encouraging of that. And then finally, with the amendments to the solicitation, the due date for the solicitation was pushed back to March 27th. So coming up, but we've still got a couple of weeks to run on that. I want to say just one other thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amy Beller. If you look at the goals of this solicitation, they're listed and Amy's going to go into a little bit more detail on this, but they're listed in the front half of or in the very beginning of the notice of funding availability. And you'll see that there are, again, some evidence of intentionality around this grant that comes from the new administration, including focusing on helping states, and as I say, including helping states transition from OA to SAA status. That is to say, having states administer their own apprenticeship programs, not having the federal government do that. Second, supporting the integrated strategies of states to be able to advance apprenticeship. That's a continuity from the state apprenticeship expansion grants in 1 and 2. Building capacity for states, particularly, and this comes from the administration, particularly through the development or expansion of pay for performance contracting methods. And we'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail towards the end of the presentation. And then finally, strengthening the national apprenticeship system, including, and back to that, cutting the red tape, reviews of the registration process, and looking for opportunities to streamline and make that process more customer focused. So with that, I'm going to put into the chat some resources that may be helpful to you, including a link to the full NOFA, a summary, which we did up pre-amendment, an annotated version of the NOFA that we did that reflects the amendments that were released last week, and then also a copy of the slide deck, which I'll say will be available immediately to you, but also will have a recording of this available for you to share with any of your colleagues who might be interested. And so with that, I am going to turn this over to my co-presenter and colleague, Amy Beller. Amy comes to us from the American Institutes for Research, has been an actively engaging states under the state apprenticeship expansion grants and indeed our apprenticeship system more generally for the last couple of years. She's going to give us some detail on the state apprenticeship expansion grant opportunity and then talk a little bit how to work with the states. Amy.
Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure to join all of you. As John mentioned, AIR has been working with states since 2016 up until just a few weeks ago, but we are still continuing to work with states and work with entities to advance apprenticeship along with the SAEF funds, but then through state and federal and local funds as well. But we're here today to talk about SEF 3, this funding announcement that that's out for state and territories. Department of Labor will invest $85 million, which 50 million of that is in base funding, which all states and territories are able to apply. Some territories have a ceiling amount of 75,000. Others have a funding amount that's listed within the FOA that each state can apply for. Then there's 35 million of that 85 million will go out for competitive funding. Up to 10 states will receive that. So you can receive the competitive along with your base. You have to submit for both, and with states that are wanting that competitive amount. The amounts ranges from $1 million to $5 million a piece for that competitive amount. The base funding amount, you can look back in the FOA. There is a chart for each state that says what the base funding amount is. It ranges from 75,000 to upwards to over $1 million with some states. This is a unique change, not a change from the amendments, but a unique change from the SEF3, is that it's a 36-month period of performance. All other grants, the base funding was a 12-month period of performance, but now they've extended it out because Department of Labor really knows that it takes a little bit of time to get programs up and going. So they gave a little bit more of that period of performance for states to actually invest and to really strategize on how they're going to use their state apprenticeship expansion funds. So DOL did issue a revised priorities, which we'll go through a little bit more. And the new deadline, as John mentioned, was March 27th. So mark your calendars. On the next slide, you'll be able to see kind of that funding overview. So what is the funding supporting? We're looking at innovations. We're looking at employer engagement with the creation and expansion of apprenticeship, which really did focus in with sector strategy. So thinking about how you look at your sectors per your state requirements, and looking at what would really work with looking at new industries and new occupations. It also looks at workforce system alignment to look at new and emerging industries. It's not just some of the other industries that we've seen work for apprenticeship, but thinking about how do you expand with new and emerging with your whole workforce system to really contribute to that long-term workforce development strategy. Really looking at that prosperity and sustainability for all, as well as you are creating these systems. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about the 4 things that have really changed. So before there was some priorities, but these priorities shifted a little bit with this amendment. The first one, there was always a priority to help states and territories to really advance system and that workforce strategy. But within the amendment, this is really looking at those Office of Apprenticeship states to move to look at to become an SAA. And you could use grant resources to help support the drafting of policies, procedures, state regulations to really streamline that registration process. So all those activities that you would have to utilize to switch from an OA to SA, you could utilize this grant funding to help support. The second funding priority that had changed is really that shifting away of the emphasis on quality jobs and naming specific sectors and occupations to really looking at what the state integrated statewide apprenticeship strategies and state capacity should be. So it's really relying upon the state, like John mentioned in our introduction, getting back to the state requirements, really looking at what the state needs are on those occupations and strategies. On the next slide, you'll see the third funding priority is to allow states and territories to really build capacity to increase and facilitate registered apprenticeship opportunities. So this could be through competitive processes within incentives and pay for performance and other performance-based contract models. We'll be going into that more. With this change, that's the percentage of incentives went from 20% to 40%, and then the cap for pay performance was also taken off. So there's a lot of new innovative ideas that you could be utilizing for this piece of incentivizing. And then the last piece is really strengthening the national apprenticeship system across state lines, increasing the transparency, the operation of plans, that really looking across like reciprocity and being able to really foster that red tape being taken away to reduce barriers for entry for new employers into new industries. So thinking across not just within your own state, but across other states and the states that really that are your neighbors to the north, south, east, and west. So on the next slide, we're going to go through just a little bit of the competitive grants because those 4 priorities are governing basically your base and your competitive, but these priorities, you actually have to pick 2. States would have to pick 2 of these components in order to apply for their competitive grants. They have to kind of shape their strategies and everything around. So I'll kind of breeze through these, but you can look to the FOA to get additional information. But looking at training services that support individuals that enroll in a REP, providing incentive funds to new and expanding, providing implementation for pay for performance, which we'll talk a little bit more, establishing statewide intermediaries or industry hubs to help facilitate that expansion of apprenticeship, provide direct funding to pre-apprenticeship programs that lead to registered apprenticeship programs. We'll talk a little bit about pre-apprenticeship here in something that has changed as well. Really looking at registered apprenticeship opportunities for youth, and they defined it 16 to 24, just like WIOA. And then assist industries to creating RAPs for entry-level occupations that are very critical to our career pathways and incumbent worker strategies to kind of look at the system as a whole. On the next slide, it goes on to talk about innovations within registered apprenticeship to assist individuals with disabilities. As John mentioned, that was one community that that is really specified within the FOA, and strategizing and implementing employer engagement methodologies to really look at adoption for in-demand industries and occupation within the state. So again, that switch about within the state of the demand occupations and demand industries, rather than the previous FOAs with SAFE 1 and SAFE 2 had preferred industries that you had to build out. 2 things that have really switched with the amendments is for states that are not currently federally recognized SAA, you can develop the required elements for recognition. As I mentioned before, you can use your funding to do that. You can also help to integrate the state workforce system underneath WIOA to support the recruitment of participants. So this is really looking at the individualized training accounts, the OJT waiver or OJT contracts that you'd have to do. So thinking about how you integrate with the system of WIOA. On the next slide, some other changes that we have seen with these amendments is the broader definition of pre-apprenticeship. We saw that quality pre-apprenticeship was struck, but pre-apprenticeship is kept. The 10 that was mentioned was struck with the components of a pre-apprenticeship, but the idea of pre-apprenticeship is still in the FOA. So that could be something that could be coming down the pike later on, looking at what that pre-apprenticeship is defined as, but you can still invest with pre-apprenticeship if it leads to that registered apprenticeship program. There is also an increased emphasis on opportunities for streamlining and finding efficiencies, just like how the Trump administration has really thought about streamlining processes and efficiencies across the government. They want to see that within apprenticeship as well. They removed the list of partner examples. There was a whole host of required of partners. They've taken that out within the SAFE 3. And then applicants also must identify one state determined performance measure related to their proposed activities regarding their outcomes and their outputs and outcomes. So before, there was a whole chart of outputs and outcomes that was in SAFE 1 and SAFE 2 that had all the defining characteristics, but now they're asking applicants to identify some state-specific information. So that's a little bit different from the previous years as well. So now that we've gone over kind of the changes of SAEF 3, let's talk about how to be the good partner with the states. So if you want to switch to the next slides, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how states are structuring their work. So there's a variety of different ways, as you probably know, with submitting grant competitions. You can structure things in many different ways to have that apprenticeship expansion effort. Because the SAF 3 with the base is always looking at capacity building in order to build up the system. So some states are engaging industries and meeting demands for new programs with traditional and emerging industries. So they're looking at what occupations, what industries to look into. to. They're also looking at system alignment, not just on workforce with WIOA, but also looking at community college, economic development, and other state agencies. This could also be if they're looking at expanding teacher registered apprenticeship programs, looking at their Department of Education and how that is integrated. So it's really looking at the systems as a whole to really move apprenticeship expansion across all levels. States are also looking at pay for performance and incentives to employers because they know that the burden that the employers pay or they use for apprenticeships sometimes is they need to see some benefits in financial incentives before they're able to invest. Some states are also updating some state data systems because there is data requirements within these grants that they want to make sure that their data system is able to report on a quarterly basis. And then they're also using some outreach activities with the funding with the base and the competitive. If you want to switch to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how if you're not part of a state system, how can you connect with state leaders on their priorities? So we're going to, just like John mentioned, we will have this up on the website afterwards that you can click on all these links. But I embedded links where we had examples of what states were doing or how you could connect. So you can talk to your state apprenticeship agencies or the agencies that are responsible for implementing the grants to learn about their grant priorities. Some states that have really done this is so actually when you connect to the states, you'll see on that website, you'll have the state apprenticeship agency connections, but then you'll also have the OA state director contact. The OA state director will be able to tell you who to connect to in the state. With some changes within apprenticeship.gov, I was unable to link directly to previous awards that would give you those state contacts, but the state OA director will help you figure out who in the state is applying for your SAFE 3 and get you connected right away. The second bullet here is talking about the strategic plans and past grant priorities. So Kansas has this really great layout of all their grant initiatives underneath the state apprenticeship expansion grants. If you click on their state, you'll see their priorities. You can see their partners that they have involved and what they're doing within each state apprenticeship grant. It's really good to see that information because as a partner, you can kind of see where do I land, and if I'm not part of those partnerships, reach out to the state and figure out how you can get back in. Massachusetts has another great strategic plan that's listed as well. You can also review the state WIOA's state plan. And this is a website that you can go directly pick down the state that you want to look at, and then you can do a find for apprenticeship, and you can see what the WIOA plan is, because then that can see the state priorities as well. You can also understand kind of the state's top occupation based upon labor market information, because most states will be looking at that information in order to integrate that into their grant opportunities. Michigan, California, and Alabama have some really good data dashboards that can be utilized, and kind of it's utilized based upon apprenticeship information, not just their labor market information for the state. On the next slide, you can also see about how states are building and supporting partnerships, because this is a big thing within states since 2016 and even before. They never want to do it by themselves. They know that they have to have partners at the table in order to expand apprenticeship, and the partners come in a wide variety of individuals, and the employers have to be at the table as well. So some states are having annual conferences. You'll see some of these annual conferences around National Apprenticeship Week. National Apprenticeship Day is in April. I believe it's like April 26th or 27th. I forgot the exact date of that. We'll find that and we'll put that into the chat. But this year it's a day versus a whole week. And then next year it will start back up for a whole week in April. But most of these conferences are around that National Apprenticeship Week timeframe. So look to see about what your state is doing for National Apprenticeship Day in conjunction with some conferences. But these are 3, Texas, Maine, and Missouri, that have hosted some great events in the past with their conferences to connect partners and employers. There's also some state websites that provide connection points that really lay out apprenticeship really well within employers, within partners, within apprentices, that you can kind of see how they have those connection points added up and how you can get into the mix on that. There's also states that have training for their partners. So Colorado does a great system that's called That's a Wrap. It's a weekly email that gets sent out with some open office hours and other training for individuals that are interested in apprenticeship along with partners. And then Kansas has a dinner bell series that they bring in guest speakers on given topics that you can learn more about apprenticeship and being able to get involved within their system. Okay, on the next slide, there's also availability for building capacity for frontline apprenticeship professionals through the Apprenticeship Professionals Learning Network. This network really helps to onboard and have that professional development for frontline apprenticeship staff. So if you're not really, you can be part of the state or you can be part of an apprenticeship program yourself and have some training. There's some self-paced asynchronous training modules that you can have on some key topics like business engagement, partner development, those type of things. There's also some enhanced learning series that can be tailored to state and industry specific needs. And we have a network over 1,000 frontline professionals that really promote that sharing and innovation there. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about items that you should consider when you're partnering. If you're new to this space and trying to figure out how to partner with states, these are some of the things that you want to keep in mind. So the states have to do participant tracking. They have to say who has been touched by these grants, especially if they're paying some type of incentive, pay for performance, or if they can be tracked back to the apprentice to have them get funding. So if you are a partner, you should be able to have a tracking system or be able to work with the state with their tracking system to know that you have to track that participant. Tracking can include a wide variety of information. So the state will help you walk through what type of information. You have to be able to report timely. They have a quarterly report that they have to submit to DOL. So being able to report your findings and what you're doing to help with the capacity really helps. Being a regional business collaborator really would help to expand the reach of apprenticeship. That's connecting with either businesses with outreach or being able to document what employers you're reaching out to versus what they're reaching out to, because there has been some oversaturation in some states within employers and everybody reaching out to the same employers. So being able to communicate with your states and working on a process really would help to have that expansion efforts go wide beyond what they were able to do. There's also some to look at state impacts. So program registration is that first step. Getting a program up and running and going is completely what they like to do. But you also want to think about the filling of the business need and that gap that you are filling with qualified apprentices, along with building out a program that is sustainable and that is meeting the business need and the apprentice need, and being able to look at supportive services for the apprentices that might need additional assistance in order to get through that first year of an apprenticeship program, since it is kind of that reduced rate. So really talking about what is needed for your apprentices, but then also what is needed for them from the business to really make that impact. And then you also want to make sure that you have a strong understanding of the outcomes that the state needs to report. So you need to understand their occupation of focus, because as this FOA has showed, there is some changes within them being able to figure out what the state would like to focus in on for occupation and industry. So understanding their occupation of interest and how you fit in would be extremely beneficial. And then you also want to be able to figure out how you align with other state and federal programs like WIOA, because if you can align with those programs, then that alignment within an apprenticeship would be easier as well. So I think I'm going to pass it back to John to talk about the pay for performance opportunity.
Sorry. Can you hear me? Yes, there we go. Hi, sorry. So thank you, Amy. That's fabulous. And that was breakneck speed through the NOFA, but appreciate your giving us that sense of sort of where the current grant opportunity stands. I'm going to turn to sort of where Amy left off and then do a deep dive on pay for performance. So you all are in states. You may not be a state, but you're interested in what's going to come out of the state apprenticeship expansion grant, both those formula funds and the competitive funding component. What can you do? Well, the first thing I would say is if you don't know who's at your state apprenticeship office or who's leading apprenticeship in your state, go to that link that was in Amy's slide. I don't know, 4 or 5 ago. Look up who's on the Department of Labor website as leading the state work for your state, and give them a call. They work for you. You're a citizen. They work for you, and say you'd like to discuss what the state's priorities are around the state apprenticeship expansion grant. I can tell you, with the amendment that went out last week, most states are rethinking their proposals. And so there's an opportunity, at least for the next week or so, while states are trying to figure out sort of how they're going to respond to this and what this is going to look like. That's an opportunity for you to say, hey, I've got an idea. We should be looking at apprenticeships in this occupation or this sector or in this town. Or I've got a new way of doing apprenticeships, and I'd really love to see how that gets connected to the work. Or I've got an idea for how the state could do apprenticeships better. It's just an opportunity to be a sort of mini advocate, and to get your 2 cents into the state apprenticeship expansion grant development process. Of course, there's no guarantee they're going to take your advice. But if they do, then you might just be ready with, hey, I'll shoot you a couple of bullet points on this. Or I've got a concept paper that I've been shopping around to other funders. Let me share that with you. Or I'm happy to sit down with some of the staff that are working on the grant and share some of my ideas. Those are all ways to sort of follow up, keep the conversation going. And of course, though the focus might be on the state apprenticeship expansion grant, being in dialogue and being in relationship with your state leaders will serve you beyond just this particular grant opportunity to be thinking about work that you might be doing together on other kinds of opportunities or work that the state's up to. So I want to speak specifically, sorry, now here we go, to the pay for performance opportunity. If you have been following Apprenticeships for America, and of course everyone has been, you know that we are a big fan of pay for performance. We don't come to this just sort of by chance. What we've done is we've looked at other countries that have rapidly expanded their apprenticeship systems. And a core piece of that seems to be a predictable formula-based funding mechanism that people who are working on apprenticeship can count on year in out and year out, to be able to support the work of developing apprenticeships. So we think pay for performance is a key way to get to this key funding mechanism. And let me just say that there's going to be, I'm going to show you an example in a second. There's many different ways to think about how to do pay for performance. But we would say that there's like 4 or 5 things that are really critical to any successful pay for performance system. The first is that there's a fixed rate schedule, that you know how much you can count on for what kind of activity. It may not be the same amount for every single apprenticeship. Maybe apprenticeships that last longer, that are a couple of years long, get a different rate than apprenticeships that are just a year long, or maybe apprenticeships in high cost training industries get a little bit more, but you know what the amount is going to be. The second is that there's predictability for the payment trigger, which allows you, if you're a practitioner, to count on, if I meet this objective, I will get this payment. The third is it's got to be additive funding. It can't be replacing funding that you used to get through one grant program and now are getting through a pay for performance. That's not really enhancing the system in our view. This should be additive funding that providers and employers and other stakeholders can rely on as they are doing apprenticeship development. Fourth is it should leverage existing data systems. So registered apprenticeship, for better or for worse, has data systems around it. It might be Rapids in your state, or it might be a state-based apprenticeship data system. But there's already apprenticeship data systems out there, and we think that the payment trigger for pay for performance should come from those data systems. And then finally, we encourage pay for performance systems that really are based on streamlined administration. So if you're going to offer people a pay for performance grant of, let's just say, $3,000, and it costs you $2,000 to apply for it, that's not very efficient. So we look for pay for performance processes that are streamlined, simple, and can be done, on a postcard or by entering information in a particular data system. Okay, so what might this actually look like? And as I said, there are many, many different approaches that states can take around pay for apprenticeship, but here's one that AFA has been using in its conversations with policymakers and practitioners. So let's suppose we had an agreement that in a particular occupation that's important to a particular state, maybe nursing, um, we're going to agree to pay intermediaries or employer sponsors $3,000 for each registered apprentice that is hired and placed in a job. And by the way, you might have some notion that they have to be in that job for 6 months in order to actually collect that money. So you're sort of taking care of the churn that happens in early months of an apprenticeship. For apprenticeships that last longer than a year, maybe you want to add, and then for once somebody's actually completed their apprenticeship, get $1,000 more. So that really incents getting people to completion. And for apprenticeships that might last for longer than a year, maybe you decide you're going to do $2,000 in the first year, $2,000 in the second year, and if there's a third year, $2,000 in the third year, as a way to recognize that longer term apprenticeship programs cost a little bit more money to administer. We suggest that intermediaries should be eligible for apprenticeship incentives. And that might include the sponsors of an apprenticeship. It might include a staffing company who's doing an apprenticeship, business services companies, other nonprofits, for-profit organizations. We suggest a very broad approach, but for the purposes of a state's focus on pay for performance, maybe the state just focuses on one particular group. So we're really interested in getting community colleges more deeply engaged in apprenticeship. Let's put a pay for performance funding plan in place for community colleges. Or we're really interested in getting chambers of commerce and business and trade associations more engaged in apprenticeship. We'll put a pay for apprenticeship system in place for that group. Again, using existing systems, we argue that you should really rely on the data entry that's already happening in the system by using Rapids or the state data system to document the success and therefore trigger the payment opportunity. And then, of course, we argue that only apprenticeships that are registered apprenticeships should be included in a pay for apprenticeship scheme because you have all that front end vetting that's part of registering the apprenticeship to make sure you've got quality. So we have a bunch of ideas about how you might use pay for performance or pay for apprenticeship models. You might want to use it in a particular industry or particular occupation that's really important to a state. Maybe it's a cybersecurity occupation, or maybe it's, as I say, a registered nursing occupation. You might look at targeted intermediaries, as I said. We're really interested in getting more of a particular group of organizations engaged in apprenticeship. Let's use pay for apprenticeship in that way. You might want to use it as a way to promote a particular economic development strategy of the state. So if you're in a region that has an economic development strategy and apprenticeship is part of that, maybe you think about, oh, let's use a pay for apprenticeship model to try and incent and support that work. Or you might be using it in service to other activities in the NOFA. So the NOFA speaks to wanting to target apprenticeships for Americans with disabilities. Maybe we use a pay for apprenticeship model to try and incent that work. In short, there's many, many different ways to use this payment mechanism and as a way to sort of start modeling how money could go out to providers and sponsors. This is just a list of some of the states that are already using versions of pay for performance in their apprenticeship programs. And by the way, enhancing or supporting or growing these pay for performance approaches seems to me to be a very good way to think about think about using that work. And I just want to call out Maryland, which is my home state. Maryland actually used its last state apprenticeship expansion grant to set up a pilot pay for apprenticeship or pay for performance model. Now the legislature is looking at a five-fold increase by using state general funds to support that work going forward. So we see opportunities to take the piloting or modeling that can happen under a state apprenticeship expansion grant and then have it become part of basic policy for the state. So that takes us to the end of our formal presentation. And while I've been talking, I haven't been looking at the chat. So let me just ask if there's any questions or comments about this presentation. You can use raise your hand, or you can put a note in the chat. Either one is fine. Any questions or comments?
John, there's a question about wages for apprentices, and in this FOA, you cannot directly pay wages to the apprentice. There could be something that you look at for wages on reducing the cost of mentorship, but the wages directly to the apprentice is unallowable in this FOA.
Great. Josh actually noted that thanks Josh Laney, who's out there somewhere. Josh, thank you for pointing out that we didn't have employers on the list. I had sponsors, so I was kind of including the employer and the sponsor. But I would say the beautiful thing about pay for performance is once the money is downstream to whoever the payee is, the payee could come up with a way of distributing that money to partners, including employers. And so we think there's many different ways to structure this, and we're supportive of experimentation because we think that will provide information to us about the best way to do this in the United States. And if I can just say, we actually just met with a staffer with a Senate committee, and he said, yeah, I'm interested in this pay for performance idea. Let's get a couple of ideas in the states, and then we can learn from that and figure out what we can do federally. So we know that the kind of work that comes out of these sorts of opportunities really does help set the stage for a national conversation around pay for performance. Yeah, so Nancy, thank you for the comment around the pre-apprenticeship, the changes in the pre-apprenticeship language in the NOFA. And let me just say, I think this is all a little bit subject to debate because we're at the level of reading tea leaves here around just what is the administration thinking around pre-apprenticeship. I know in the trade press, there was a little bit of a conversation going on about, was the administration walking away from pre-apprenticeship, or was this signaling a de-emphasis of a pre-apprenticeship? And I think the answer there is we just don't know enough about exactly what's going on. I think the general thing that I take from the NOFA, and this is just one person's opinion, so you can ignore it, is that the level of directedness that's coming from the Department of Labor is being reduced. So states are given more latitude to try their own thing, whatever's appropriate to the state. You can argue, that might send us down some, false paths or wrong roads or whatever. But that, just because I saw it in several places in the NOFA, that's my take from it, but it's just one person's take. We will learn more as this administration gets settled and as we have leadership at the Department of Labor to articulate a policy on it. Amy, do you want to take the question about data collection here?
Yeah, so thanks, Chip, for the question on data collection on individuals who are funded for pay for performance. If as they're like under like another reimbursement, that is yet to be determined. I think that once you'd have to ask the Department of Labor on what their requirements are going to be for the pay for performance, if it's going to be a participant or if they're going to be considered reportable individuals. That is not stated within the FOA, and I don't want to make any educated guess. So that would be a really good question for Department of Labor to weigh in on what they would be considered the pay for performance. If it can't be tracked back, in other SAEF grants, if the funding couldn't be tracked back to a specific individual, then it would be an income a reportable individual. But if it could be tracked back, which I think that the pay for performance would be tracked back because you're able to kind of dot back, then you'd have to do the long reportable or the participant level services. That's what is what I'm guessing, but we would have to confirm with Department of Labor on that question, Chip.
There's a great question about, where you might find other stakeholders in the system around apprenticeship, people you might work with or might want to go to the state with. And oftentimes, not every state, but often states will have a list of registered apprenticeship programs. That's a great place to go to find out who's already in the mix, who's doing work, and use that as a way to identify where there might be, fellow partners that you could go to the state with. I'll also just note that the apprenticeshipstandards.org is a national database that's really intended to sort of offer up samples of what apprenticeship design can look like. And it's got, I think, like 10,000 different apprenticeships in it. So not like every apprenticeship, but there's often in every state, there's somebody in there who's doing something on something. And so you can use that as a way to find some of those organizations as well. Is there any other questions that didn't get highlighted in the chat or that people would like to speak to directly here?
I would just say there's some discussion
Ethan,
about
right.
wages.
No, go ahead, Amy, and then we'll go to
sorry.
Ethan.
There's some discussion about wages and that being paid. If on page 36 of the FOA, it goes into the use of grant funds for participant wages that, like I mentioned, grant funds were not able to pay directly to the apprentice, but for OJT, funds can be used to subsidize the training and education cost of the apprentice enrolled. And there's more information on, like, there's 50% of the hourly wage. There's some additional information that you want to consult on page 36 and 37 as it results to what can be paid and what cannot be used for the federal piece.
Ethan, you want to jump in here?
Yes. First, thank you so much, John and Amy, for hosting this webinar. As always, really fantastic information. So my question popped up quite a bit earlier, so apologies for the delay here in re-asking it. But I would love to know if we end up in a world where industry recognized apprenticeship programs or other kind of non-registered apprenticeship programs are being expanded under the Trump administration, how do you see the pay for performance model working, just given that those don't necessarily have the same quality standards? How do we basically avoid fraud or abuse, which are big words in the media and in the government nowadays? But how do we avoid that when we don't have program standards that are as stringent?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in fact, it was the problem with the IRAP proposals as they were initially proposed, right? Was trying to figure out, what is a quality control mechanism? What does that look like? So I don't think anyone has exactly an answer. I mean, there was a proposed set of regulatory processes around IRAPs that was put up for consideration in the last administration. They could dust those off and see where those go. We just don't know where that's headed. So we'll see.
Thank you. Reading tea leaves. Really appreciate it, and thanks again for hosting the webinar.
Excellent. Any other questions, comments from the group?
Hi, I was just wondering if you can repeat the website that you mentioned that shows samples of different apprenticeship.
Absolutely. It's apprenticeshipstandards.org. And it's a website that is developed and managed by the Urban Institute. and it's a great resource. So I can just
Thank
shout
you.
it out. Yep. Any other comments? Oh, yeah, and actually Brittany says, put it in the chat. Of course I should do that, so I will. Any other comments before we sign off here or actually go to our after the webinar conversation? All right, hearing none, I just want to thank everyone for participating. It's great to be with 90 people this afternoon talking about state apprenticeship expansion grants. Hello, fellow apprenticeship nerds. It's great to be with you, and look forward to keeping you engaged as we go. I do want to I have a couple of quick announcements. AFA is going to be doing 2 other webinars coming up next month. The first one is going to be a joint webinar with our friends at the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning. We're going to be talking about a really exciting joint partnership that brings together the AFA and KL memberships in new ways. So looking forward to having you there. That's going to be April 9th. And then April 18th, we have a webinar, a master session, we're calling it, or master class in looking at recruitment for apprenticeship programs. How do we recruit apprentices, and what are some of the best practice examples of doing that? So we're really looking forward to having you. I'm going to put some information in the chat. Sorry, I should have been up on that. Look forward to keeping you all apprised of those development opportunities as they come. Thanks so much.